Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. Commander Cube Draft is a mini-series where I'm going to be talking about everything Cube Draft, but related specifically to the Commander format. Throughout this series, I'm going to be explaining the process behind how I brewed my own Commander Cube, as well as pointers on how to build your own. I'll also be reviewing and analyzing many topics and aspects when it comes to building your own cube. In this episode in particular, I have the absolute privilege of being joined by John from Cultic Cube. We'll be discussing the basics of cube design and how mastering those basics of this limited environment can help you with more specifically tailored cubes such as a Commander Cube. If you like any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It will really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to certain videos on YouTube. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Since this mini-series is meant to show different aspects of drafting a Commander Cube, if you want to know what a cube is and how it pertains to Commander, I suggest you first watch the first episode, which you can find in the link above. I invite you to watch all the other episodes in that playlist to help you better build a Commander Cube. In this episode, I'm going to pick John's brain for his expertise and experience to all things cube. When I finally got the inspiration to build a Commander Cube, I did some research online. Unfortunately, back then there were hardly any resources when it came to Commander Cubes. That is one reason I decided to begin this mini-series. However, in terms of actual cube building, I stumbled across John's YouTube channel, Cultic Cube. I consumed every single video. His channel is, in my opinion, the best resource for all things cube. His videos are massively produced, his exposition is unparalleled, and his guides are masterclass worthy. Even though not everything can be done to a T when it comes to cubes like mine, the basics that I learned helped me greatly improve upon the mess that I made from just scrapping together all of my bulk stored away in shoe boxes in my closet, having piles of cards strewn across my board gaming table. So without further ado, let's bring out our guest. Welcome to the Commander Tavern. Now, I love your YouTube channel, that's nothing new, and it's awesome to have you here, so thank you for finally being able to come on board.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Kirby. This is a lot of fun. So yeah, we've been talking for a long time. I've got enormous respect for your channel and what you're doing over there. So I really appreciate you having me. This is great to get to talk in person.
Yeah, thank you. The feeling is mutual. Much appreciated. So, for those who haven't known yet, John here is from Cultic Cube, a YouTube channel, obviously about all things cube. So we've been talking a little bit before about what we can do and things like that concerning cube and how it pertains to different formats. But I guess the first question is the elephant in the room, which is what is a good but simple starting point for someone wanting to build their first cube?
Yeah, right. Well, cube can be so many different things to so many different people. So that's a big question about a big topic. And so I guess I'd say, well, let me start by giving a very rough definition of cube, which doesn't encompass everything that a cube might be necessarily. But when we're talking about cube, people typically think of this as a custom draft environment, an environment that's meant to be played as a limited environment, like retail booster draft might be. It's typically singleton, but it certainly doesn't have to be. And it typically has a minimum of 360 cards in the environment, because that's how many cards we would need to draft 3 packs of 15 cards with 8 people, right? So this is what people typically are talking about with cube. So we need a bunch of cards to make a cube. We want at least 360 cards. So for me, at least the way I got started was it was back in 2011 when we had Innistrad block, and oh my gosh, I loved triple Innistrad draft. That was so much fun, and I drafted the heck out of that set. And when that set was going away, indeed, even as the block progressed, the block got kind of worse and worse, I think, as we kept adding,
Yeah.
adding to the block. Triple Innistrad was where it was at from my perspective. I really wanted to recreate, maybe not recreate the experience of Triple Innistrad exactly. Like I didn't want to photocopy that experience necessarily, but I wanted to recapture something of that and be able to keep doing it after that retail set was going away. So I sat down with my boxes of draft chaff and I just spread out a whole bunch of cards around me, and I started just picking out cards, going sort of color by color and picking out cards that I thought were cool cards, you know? And I don't know how many I picked out, but 100 cards in each color or something. I don't know.
I was gonna say, I imagine it was more than 360 cards.
It was, yeah, exactly, right. Picked out a whole ton of cards and then started trying to winnow it down. And so I was just like sitting in the middle of my living room with all of these cards, right?
Yeah,
spread out around me. And that was a super fun project. And then that's how I built my first cube. And like, it was a first draft, and I got some friends together and we played it, and then we kept tinkering with it. I won't even say that it was. I mean, I think I improved the cube massively over time, and I learned a lot as I went along. But that's not to say that the initial effort was bad at all. Like my friends and we had a ton of fun drafting the thing, So I would encourage people to get a whole bunch of cards and spread them out and start picking cards that you like. And I think you'll almost certainly start seeing through lines, start seeing themes in the kind of cards that you like, right? And things are going to start to gel, and you'll start getting ideas about archetypes and things. And I wouldn't be afraid to dive in and do it, because it's going to be awesome. And then you're going to have a lot of fun building it and playing it, and as you continue, you'll refine your ideas, but it's going to be a great time from the get-go. So
I imagine that's every like cube creator's origin story. It's just like, I have these boxes of cards, I have no idea what to do with them, I want to play them with people, and you just sit down, ooh, I like this one, ooh, I like this one, I like this one, and then until it comes to a point where these mountains and mountains of cards, and you just mix it all together, and then all right, hope the math checks out at the very least, right?
Right. Yeah, and I say 360 cards is the minimum, but also like we shouldn't get bent out of shape about numbers at all. So if you've got 370 cards in your cube, who cares, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It makes no difference. If you've got 500 cards in the cube, that's great. And similarly, some people get really uptight about what people in the cube curation community sometimes call spreadsheet aesthetics, whereby people are trying to make sure that if you've got X number of white cards in the cube, then you also have X blue cards and black cards and red cards and green, and make sure everything lines up perfectly and looks beautiful, like on a spreadsheet. And if that's what you're into, then by all means do that thing. But also, if that's not what you're into, then definitely don't feel bad that it doesn't matter at all, right?
Yeah, because even Magic sets are lopsided in terms of color identity.
Right, yeah, that's absolutely true. And nobody's going to know either. Nobody's going to get mad at you. It's your environment. And from your drafter's point of view, unless things are wildly lopsided, then nobody's ever going to know the difference, right? If you've got 10 more white cards than you have blue cards in the cube, there's no way a drafter is going to know that unless they're staring at the list, right? And even then, who cares?
Yeah, of course. I imagine that from what I gather, right, from some of the videos you've made of those, initial steps of how to get about it, is that the most important thing is like a base that you're comfortable with, that you would say, okay, this is functional, right? It's not just taking boxes of cards and then, all right, let's draft this. That's not really, you could if you want to, I guess, right? Because there's no restriction on what you want to do. But I feel like maybe once you have a solid foundation where you're like, okay, let me at least play with this. It's like you mentioned, it's going to be fun because you're putting the cards you want that will be fun, that you think everyone else will find fun. And then that fine tuning that you mentioned, obviously that would come after if you want to like improve it per se. It's not necessarily, the experience is going to be better in terms of entertainment, but maybe better in terms of consistency or power level or all those other kinds of things.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think that when we're building cube environments, I'm assuming most people who are interested in building cube environments have built decks, whether standard decks or commander decks or draft decks or whatever the thing is. So we know the basics of these things. And of course, one of the fundamentals is paying some attention to curve.
Yeah.
What curve looks like in these environments is going to be very different. All that probably, right? But we understand that basic conceit. And what I'm getting at is that we can transport that idea to cube design, and we should, import that idea to cube design. So obviously, unless this is what you're going for, you don't want the cube that's like mono 6-drops. You want a mana curve among the spells in your cube, and you want the curve weighted towards the early part of the curve, right? Obviously.
Yeah, of course. And
so you're using that same kind of. No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say that it's like having a goal in mind to like at least have some, even if it's not the end goal, but maybe like an intermediate goal, right? Where you're slowly but surely like checking off things that you want to eventually get to, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I'm with you. It's a process. I think for most people, this is another thing that I think we share among a lot of different formats. I imagine this is true of Commander players too. The deck isn't the deck is always in process.
Yep.
Or at least
never
that's
finished.
How I think about. It's never finished, right? That's how I think about my cubes too. There's never a point in time where I, dust off my hands and say, that's that. This cube is now going to be set in amber like a prehistoric mosquito or something, and it's fixed in time. It's always something that's evolving and that we're improving or that we're taking in different directions or whatever, and that's part of the joy of cube design.
Yeah. I think also since the massiveness, right, that you're like preparing this experience for so many people, and just by math alone you have to have a certain amount of cards and whatnot, but it's some people I find might encounter it to be maybe a bit overwhelming to pay attention to so many things, especially when you reach like the fine-tuning aspect, right? It's like, okay, I have all these cards I like, but I enjoyed the experience so much, I think it could be better, right? So like I first went through that, alpha phase, to put it that way, where we're beta testing when, this monstrosity I came up with. And then they want to try and improve a little bit, not necessarily like you mentioned, unless you do want to have it super balanced and whatnot. But when do you feel that, when it comes time to that, what would be like a good path, right? To not necessarily follow strictly, because it's always fun, to diverge a bit. But when do you think someone's starting off after they've reached that point where they have more or less a goal in mind, like we mentioned? Oh, I want my cube to do this because I found it so much fun, I want to keep working on it. When do you think, or how should someone maybe apply other aspects? You mentioned mana curve, which is super important, right? But how about other aspects, maybe like power level or archetypes or synergies that overlap and things like that? How do you feel that design process could be for players now a little bit more goal-oriented with their cube design?
Oh, yeah. Those are all great questions, great things to be thinking about. I think these are all things that ideally we've got in the back of our mind as we're designing cubes, in the same way as when we're working on EDH decks. People have tried to institute all sorts of systems for ranking the power level or the relative fairness or sort of friendliness of different commander decks, right? Like people have proposed different systems. It's the same with cubes, of course, where there are lots of different proposals for how we're going to rate cubes according to these different metrics. All of them, I think, are good thought experiments. I don't know. I don't have a system that I think is like the be all and end all for how we're going to rate cubes in these various ways. And as far as I know, in EDH, it's sort of a similar story, right? It's hard to.
Oh yeah, in EDH, you mentioned the discourse between. I think you mentioned like the purists with the Excel spreadsheets that they want everything to be super neat and visually aesthetic because everything's the same. In EDH is more or less the same thing. You have people saying, yo, you have to have this percentage has to be this percentage has to be that. You have to have this mana curve. And while those are things that probably developed from players who played other formats where those things do matter, at the end of the day, if I want to have an EDH deck where every single card costs 7 because that's a theme or whatever, that's fine. You're not wrong, right? But it's what you want. So right. like you mentioned, yeah, in EDH is the same thing. But since I'm playing and maybe I find joy in what I'm doing, you mentioned also the player aspect of curating a cube where you want that experience amongst other people. So maybe that's something that you also want to tinker with, not necessarily what the community's forcing you to do, but about your personal experience and what you would want it to be.
Yeah, right. I'm totally with you. And these are good things to be thinking about. And we can import, I think, in cube design a lot of those similar heuristics that we're using in designing EDH decks and thinking about the power level that we're targeting there and what's going to be fun for the table. We're trying to think in similar terms as we're designing cubes, such that we want, in general, my cubes to have a relatively flat power level. That's not to say that there aren't more and less powerful cards. There certainly are going to be, almost definitionally. But I try to sort of minimize the power peaks and the power troughs in the environment, because I don't want people to, let's say, wander into a trap whereby I might have signals that there's some kind of archetype that's supported, but then, in fact, it's not. So, I'm being like super theoretical here. So, but to give an example, let's say you wouldn't want to put an entomb in a cube that doesn't support Reanimator.
Exactly.
Somebody opens a pack and sees that entomb. That's a first pickable card that should suggest to a canny drafter Reanimator is a thing. So I'm going to slam this entomb. And then if the Reanimate never comes around, that's a problem. And you've created a trap for your drafter, and that's a feel bad, right?
Yeah, it's a dead card.
Right, exactly. What the heck is this thing doing in my pool? So we don't want to create traps for people. We don't want to create, or at least I don't want to create, even well-supported archetypes that are just woefully underpowered or woefully overpowered compared to the rest of the field. So these are things to be thinking about, and that I think a lot of us who are enfranchised Magic players on some level are going to have a feel for. So we can trust our instincts, and then we're going to refine the environment, and we're going to learn and may be surprised by this thing or that thing, but we're going to keep tinkering, and we're going to make things still better for everybody, where the goal for me is for all of my players to have as positive a play experience as possible. I want people to feel good playing the cube. And,
of course. And the balance as well, because if I made a cube that was just from the Lauren block, obviously no one's drafting giants. Everyone's going to gun for the fairies. So there's also that, right? There's also that sense that there has to be some balance. Like if you like all the cards you're putting in the cube, okay, I like all these good white cards, I like all these good blue cards, because you have to have some balance. Otherwise, no one's gonna draft either that archetype or that pack of cards, and it'll always be like the hot potato just getting passed around until someone's left with it, and then they're not gonna put it in their deck. They'd rather play Lasix at that point.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. That's a really good point. And that's in this is another way in which I personally am perfectly willing to fudge some of my prescriptions that I give myself when designing a cube in order to for people to have a better play experience overall. So it could be, for example, that you're trying to create a set cube, like you're talking about a Lorwyn block cube, and you know from your experience playing Lorwyn block that Giants is not where you want to be.
Exactly.
You know? Well, you can address that, right? You're the designer, right?
Exactly.
You're Mark Rosewater now, darn it. You get to do what you want. So for me, I don't get like super bent out of shape. I've made set cubes, right? And maybe 90% of the cards in a set cube will be from that set. But for me personally, I'm totally happy to dip out of that set in order to shore up weaknesses or correct imbalances in various ways.
That's interesting.
And I still want to maintain the flavor of that world, but like maybe I can find ways of making Giants more viable than they might otherwise have been. Or you find some interesting thing like an Amonkhet Limited in retail draft. You really wanted to be in an aggressive shell.
Yep, Afflict was the thing.
That was where it was at. Yeah, for sure. There were all these other cool things that the set was trying to do, like all the cycling stuff with things like Drakehaven and Archfiend of Ifnir. That's super cool stuff, but like if you're trying to do that at the draft table, you probably weren't meeting with that success. Yeah. But in a cube, you can do that, and you can stick a Merfolk Looter into the deck, or what into the cube, or whatever, to shore up that archetype and make that more viable and allow people to move in different directions and shy away from the sort of monoculture where everybody is vying for that one particular archetype.
That's interesting. It's sort of like you're adding list cards to your cube where, if you crack this pack of this quote unquote Lorwyn block, you have this list card of this good giant support card, right?
Yeah, that's true. Right. It's maybe a little bit like when core sets were a thing, and that could be a kind of bridge between these different environments. And, if the environment needed a giant spider, then you could just print that in the core set, right? And
it's also a good surprise too. Like no one's gonna expect that in a block cube where you're expecting everything from this block, and then all of a sudden, oh wait, there's this card here. Awesome.
Yeah, this is true. That's true. And I can understand how somebody might be upset about that and be like, darn it, this is not a Lorwyn card. And fair enough.
Yeah.
So if that's the way you approach things, I can totally respect that. For what it's worth, though, let me see. Can I see if I can find this thing? You may well know all about this. There's this website that has these different different places in the multiverse, like Ravnica and whatever, different planes, and then they, you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, and then they tell you what cards go to that plane.
Yeah, as suggested by the art or the flavor text.
Yeah, I've seen that site. It's on the tip of my tongue because core sets don't really have a plane setting, but sometimes core sets bring things from even Ulgrotha. I think there's a card called Barony. Vampire of the Barony or something like that, and you see Ulgrotha in the backyard, like the Sendure Castle, and that's from a core set. So I know which site you're talking. I'll probably obviously in post-production, for those still listening, that I'll probably show it on the screen or something, but I know the site you're talking about, and it mentions where it should be, like Chandalar or Lorwyn, because there are core sets where you see things from Chandalar and the core set's not in Chandalar.
Right, exactly. I found it. It's called mtg-multiverse.com.
All right, perfect.
So you can pick a plane, and so just like at random, I've clicked on Ravnica here, and they show you these cards. So for instance, Gigantoplasm from Commander 2015. Mm-hmm. This is a card that's it wasn't
set
printed
in
any Ravnica block. Yeah, but it's got a picture of Fibblethip on it, who's grown very large, and the flavor text says, "I appreciate things that exceed expectations," and it's Mizzix that the thing is attributed to. So the card looks I mean, WotC has designed it to as if it were from Ravnica.
Even
right?
Mizzix. Mizzix is a character from Ravnica that has not appeared in any Ravnica set. Same with Mazirek and a whole bunch of others.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. That's cool. That's good. Right. So if you're concerned, if you're trying to do a Lorwyn thing and you want cards outside of Lorwyn, there are resources like this that allow you to find cards that are still going to fit flavorfully.
Yeah.
Even if they were never printed in
a Lorwyn block.
So that's a cool thing to know about.
Yeah, that's a very good tool that from some obscurity in my subconscious I forgot about. But yeah, you can still stick to flavor and theme because those cards are, for all effects and purposes, set on that plane.
Yeah, right. That's nice. And I'm sure this kind of thing we're getting more and more of now with things like secret layers, and you can find ways of fudging cards and getting them to fit your environment.
It's even happened.
Rationalize that.
Yeah, of course, and it's even happened backwards. Remember, Conspiracy, those sets are supposed to be set on Fiore, I think the plane is called, but not every card was a new card. Most of Conspiracy was a reprint. Only like a handful of cards were characters, or things on that setting. But it's for all effects and purposes on that plane. So, but you're having cards from Ravnica, from whatever. So even WotC has done it, right? So even if you want to bend it a little bit, there is some form of precedent for it.
Yeah, for sure. You can make it work. And for me, as I say, the most important thing is coming up with an awesome environment that people are going to have a good experience with.
Yeah.
So gameplay trumps everything as far as I'm concerned. And other people may be different, and that's totally fine. Because I'm not particularly of Orthos. I don't get super into the lore of the game. Mm-hmm. That's another way people can appreciate the game.
Of course.
That's great. But I put on my designer hat, and that's the thing that I care most about.
Yeah, at least for myself, since the cube I've basically been curating for all these years is commander focused, and that commander is a format that it is restricted in terms of color identity. So for me, the challenge, mathematically at least for my cube, is having everything not be lopsided. For example, the mana base is very important. If I'm going to give players enemy colored commanders, but WotC still has a lot of land mega cycles where the enemy colored cards are missing, I can't provide all of those lands for one set of potential decks, but not for the other. So I have to be very careful with my mana base. Like if I'm going to have the shock lands, I want to have all 10 shock lands. If I want to have the tangle lands, I can't. I have to wait until the other ones are made, or maybe put enemies of others. So that kind of restriction, although it does breed creativity, that's something that's, for myself, as you mentioned, me as the curator is what I want, because it's what's going to be expected as well from my players. Like if I draft a wedge colored commander, I want to be able to draft also an appropriate land base for it, because otherwise I'm not going to have a functional deck. And that avoids the feel bads that you mentioned earlier. You want to not just curate the cube, but you're curating the cube for the experience of, having it played with other players.
Yeah, right. That is a tough thing for sure. And I appreciate those difficulties that you're describing in balancing things when WotC hasn't given us all the tools to balance stuff necessarily. Like, speaking of Amonkhet, there are those cycling lands, like irrigated floodlands.
Yep, right? The bicycle lands. It's lopsided, yeah. I mean, I guess at least since the focus WotC has so largely on Commander now, that they'll eventually feel maybe that pressure to start balancing things, because it is helpful for the player to be able to build anything. But right now, let's say I'm playing with fetch lands, there are fewer dual typed lands for enemy colors than there are for allied colors, and that creates a lopsidedness.
Right. And so with lands in particular, I don't feel much compunction in breaking singleton. Here's another way in which I'm happy to break the rules for. So because the rules are self-imposed, like we said before, we control the ban list, right? I mean, we're
Yep.
making the rules. So I've, for years and years, run double fetches in my environments, and I love it. I'm a very strong advocate, if you're into it, for double fetches, because I want fixing to be good for my players. It's an old bit of wisdom that people include something like 10%
fixing
mana fixing in their cube, and I think that's too low. I think more like 15% is an amount that I'm happier with, because I want my people to be able to play Magic, and I don't. I hate non-games where people feel bad because they're sitting there color screwed. People are gonna get screwed on stuff as it is, because like that's Magic and that's fine, right? So I don't want to increase that pressure towards screw that may already exist.
Yeah. I even did that with my own cube, in the sense that, because for example, look at Commander Legends and stuff like that, and even Dominaria, and now Dominaria United, every pack's going to have X amount of legendary creatures guaranteed. I have to do that, obviously, when I'm drafting. I have to collate and seed my packs to present that same experience. But at the same time, I didn't want players choosing between mana fixing lands and a card they can put in the deck. So at the very end of my draft, the first 4 packs are like you would expect if you are cracking Commander Legends or Double Masters or whatever. But then that last pack is solely mana fixing lands. But not lands with any abilities, not like a Cur Keep or Mistveiled Plains or something like that. It's literally just check lands, pain lands, gates,
right,
where you can now, you can breathe, because you already more or less throughout the draft have an idea of what colors you're going to build. Those are the lands you're going to pick. And that actually goes really quickly, because people are, I'm playing, I don't know, red, green, white. I'm picking every white, red, green, white, green, So, and that helps along. And that's been very useful for my players, because it takes the pressure off, and it makes it easier to build a deck of the format that you're playing with. So even in that sense where it's complicated, when I make it more simpler to a level like you're describing, I think about the same thing. It's like, okay, let's say I'm drafting a blue-white archetype or whatever, but then let's say I never drafted a single blue-white land, and all I have in there are plains and islands. What if, I'm unlucky, I have a majority blue hand, but all my lands are plains? I can't play anything.
Yeah, for sure. That's an issue. And I like that solution. That makes a lot of sense to me, because in traditional cube formats, another thing that I advocate is that people be very judicious in including gold cards. But here I'm talking about a traditional cube environment, which is different from what you're describing. So when you're drafting 3 packs of 15 cards with a table of 8 people, gold cards, people get super excited about, because gold cards, they're often, they're awesome cards.
Yeah.
But like with 2-color gold cards, there's the 10 guilds, right? If you've got 8 people sitting around the table, it is any given single color card, all things being equal, there's going to be a 40% chance that somebody wants a single color card, typically. But if you've got a 2-color card, you've got an Azorius card or something, it's possible that nobody at the table is Azorius, right?
Exactly.
So that card then is just a dead card, and it goes around and around the table. And then this problem is only exacerbated when we start talking about 3-color cards and more, right? Like how likely is it that somebody is exactly Mardu colors at the table, right? And so anyway, these kinds of things make me want to really limit the number of gold cards that I have, and really think carefully about the kinds of gold cards I'm putting in. So something like Vindicate, that's a great catch-all kind of card, but it's also a card that, like, we can manage that effect in other colors, in single colors. Right? So do we really need a Vindicate? Do we really need a Lightning Helix? Do we really need the Assassin's Trophy or something in the cube? But all that having said all of that, you are designing a special environment that's celebrating gold cards.
Yep.
And like you're expecting and wanting people to draft these multicolor decks. And so your solution for having a separate land draft, I love that, because that solves my complaint, right? Like you're giving people an opportunity to find the fixing they need in order to support whatever colors they're trying to support. That makes a lot of sense to me. I love it.
Yeah, thanks. Because for me, the logic is, look at, for example, what WotC did with Streets of New Capenna, right? A lot of cards, not that they had like, it wasn't land cycling like the Alara block. It was, oh, you pay this amount, you exile it, and this land can now tap for, whatever color. Or the new panorama style cards where they enter tapped, but they immediately get sacked and you gain a life or whatever. When I was designing my cube, I'm like, I really don't want players to have to pick a card solely because they're thinking, oh, I'm going to need the color fixing. This is just some boring card that I'm just going to use, throw it away, get some mana value from it. Because the cube does have, your regular mana acceleration pieces like rocks and ramp spells in every color. Because that's the thing. Like if you really research, you can find mana dorks even in white. You have you have the gold myrrh. There's even this card from a Lara block. It taps for colorless, but it's white. Blue has some colorless tappers too, and the dark, believe it or not, the dark had a whole bunch of mana dorks off of green. So that's fun because it's unexpected. Like no one's looking through a card. Oh wait, this red card taps for red. So that's the kind of thing I wanted, to have that fun factor along with the utility. But since lands are so important, I felt that that's something I had to do. But notice, I'm the curator. Like you mentioned, like we're like the kings of our world. We do whatever we want. We set our own rules. Mm-hmm. I have my constrictions. Like, okay, I want it to follow this. I want to have these archetypes. I want to have these fun, janky cards and experiences. But at the same time, it has to be supported, because you can have the best idea in the world, but if it's just a sandcastle on the coast, the tide's gonna come. It's gonna take it away. You have to have some kind of balance between functionality and what you want from the experience.
Yeah, that's true. A related point, I think, to one you're making there about ensuring that things are supported is that if people are interested in beginning their cube design journey, I would encourage people to make the smallest functional cube that makes sense to them that they can. So a 360 card cube if you're interested in a traditional draft format. Mm-hmm. Because this allows you it's 360 cards, it's still a lot of cards. Yeah. But it's, smaller than 720 cards,
of course,
example, right? So you're dealing with less. You're like worrying about less. And this allows you to it helps to ensure that you can support the archetypes that you want to support, because the more cards you add to the environment, the less likely it is that people are opening given components of any given archetype.
Exactly.
And so if you've got like some key piece, if you've got like, say you're trying to support Burning Vengeance for some reason. I mean, this would be hard to do at all, I think, right? But you're trying to do a Burning Vengeance thing from Innistrad block, which deals as an enchantment that deals damage when you flash a card back.
Right? Yeah.
Right. So you could have a million flashback cards in the cube. That's cool. But then you're not going to have a million to begin with, right? You're going to have as many flashback cards with flashback as you can find. If you've only got one Burning Vengeance in the cube
and it doesn't come out,
this to be a deck, and nobody ever sees it, right? Then that's a problem, right? And there are lots of cards that archetypes can be built around that have this kind of issue, like Birthing Pod. We're getting increasing alternatives to Birthing Pod, thank goodness. But so maybe you can do Birthing Pod now with some of this additional support. But if you'd have asked me even a couple of years ago, about having a birthing pod archetype in a cube, I would have strongly encouraged you to just break singleton and run a couple of birthing pods.
Yeah.
Darn it. Right. Because you have to see it in the draft, A, and B, you could easily draft a deck that's designed to be a birthing pod deck, and then like you play these games, and when you don't draw a birthing pod, the deck is just a mess.
It doesn't
just
work.
Like this value mess. Yeah, right, exactly. So the smaller your cube environment, the easier it is for you to control the cards that people are seeing when, and allow you to build that density that you want in order to support the things that you're trying to support.
Yeah, exactly. I remember when I first built mine, and I think I still have that list somewhere because I kept it for prosperity, right? That this alpha version of my cube, it was like a hodgepodge, but since I have so many cards, the good thing about at least building a cube for a commander is that if players are picking a commander, some commanders already have that built-in archetype. So let's say, for example, Brago, King Eternal is a potential commander to pick in a cube. You're going to want to have...
That's an awesome card.
Yeah, you're going to want to have things that trigger when they enter the battlefield. But at the same time, if you also have Yarok, the Desecrated, in your cube, you have another commander with a similar archetype that cares about things entering the battlefield, but maybe it does it via reanimation because it's black. But since they have that overlapping color blue, you can try and maybe have more of the blue cards have that ETB trigger. And that's sort of like where the fine tuning comes in. Like, okay, I want to support reanimators. So maybe you'll have different commanders, quote unquote, that are reanimators, so that even if different players are picking those commanders, obviously, part of the fun of the cube draft is, I picked this first, but it wasn't necessarily a hate pick. It's just that I got the reanimation piece first before you did, because I'm also building reanimator. But since it's different colors, maybe you have reanimator with mana acceleration, or maybe you have reanimator with control, or maybe you have blink with control, or maybe you have blink with reanimator. So when I sat down and actually said, okay, let's figure out, not just by color restriction and having nothing be lopsided, having everything be even, but amongst that evenness that I'm choosing, apart from the fun factor, because not every commander can be functional, that would take away also a sense of a player just wanting to have some good stuff deck. But there is that overlapping synergy, and the more and more I tinker with the cube, because obviously it will never be finished ever, right? But it is a matter of like fine tuning. Like every time a new set comes out, I try not to put too many new cards from the set out of hype, because I also want to keep some old cards in the cube for that discovery factor. It's like, oh wow, I didn't know this card existed, or a lot of cards that are obscure. Oh, I didn't know this card existed. So it's always this balance between, do I want it super optimal? Do I want it super powerful? Or do I want it just to be efficient? Do I want to have, that experience? And I think that comes from the base of what you mentioned of, once you have your goal set, how you're going to have people draft it. So at least for me, not just mana curve, because if I look at the mana curve on my cube, on Cube Cobra, which is an excellent tool, by the way. I think you have a couple of videos on Cube Cobra. My cube has...
And it's designed by Gwen Decker, just to say. We'll put in a plug for him.
100%. I love this site. I'm glad it also has multiplayer drafting.
That's a new feature. That's so cool. And
super
Gwen
hyped for that.
Is also a colleague, a co-organizer of
CubeCon, right?
So
that's coming up.
He's great people. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, amazing team.
He started Cube Cobra, and now he's got a whole team of people who are working on this. Totally, it's free, it's open source, it's got all these designers who are constantly iterating on it and making it better. So, I'm putting a plug for all these things.
Yeah, 100%. I love this site. I think most of the videos I work on for my mini series, I'm always showing people, oh, this is what I'm doing on Cube Cobra, because I remember when I had it on Cube Tutor. And then when Cube Cobra came up, like, oh wow, I really like all these features. And then unfortunately, Cube Tutor couldn't keep up, with I don't remember what kind of maintenance or whatever it was. So I passed everything full time to Cube Cobra, and I love it. Like right now, I'm looking at the chart for my mana curve, And, obviously my cube has all of those lands specifically for mana fixing. So if you ignore those 2 huge spikes in the 0 CMC column, you see the bell curve. And that wasn't intentional. It's just that as a player, like you mentioned, how would I build my deck? I would not build a deck where all cards are super high on the mana curve. So obviously, I have cheap ramp spells, but I have expensive bombs. But not every bomb, is a 10 mana or something mana like that. So you can have those tools. It's really helpful for fine tuning also to have a visual guide like Cube Cover, because maybe your cube can start, beginning to feel fine tuned. And that's where you really have to put like the math work in it. Not necessarily hyper specific like you mentioned, but I can notice, oh wait, I think I'm putting in too many 6 CMCs cards. I'm taking out too many 2 CMCs for them. Let me maybe hold back on that. Or maybe this set doesn't have as many cards that would support this archetype. Or maybe this new set brought forth a new archetype that I really like, that I want to try, and break in. It's like, it's just ever growing. I think we could probably talk for hours about, all the ins and outs of curating a cube, because that's what it is. It's like a child that you're growing and you're seeing it develop, and now soon it's going to go to college and all that stuff,
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. It's so cool, all of these visualization techniques it gives you. That's an excellent point. Tools like this are super useful for getting a different perspective on your environment. And tools like this are also useful for, as you mentioned earlier, allowing you to draft your environment. Mm-hmm. So even if you don't get to play, most of us don't get to play our cubes every day or whatever, but if you had the time and the inclination, you could hop on a site like Cube Cobra and you could draft your cube every day, or whenever, you're on your lunch break or something. If
exactly.
This is what you feel like doing on your lunch break, you can get in a couple of drafts. And this is super useful playtest experience, right? Mm-hmm. It's a fun thing to do, but you're also getting this a kind of hands-on experience with your cube and seeing how often, like how easy it is for you to put together this archetype that you're hoping to make a thing in your cube, right? Or get a different perspective on what the curve feels like in the cube overall from the perspective of a person who's getting packs passed to them, right? And what kinds of things they're seeing.
Exactly.
Anyway, that's great.
Yeah, and I also like, for example, the variance. Since my cube could be drafted between 4 to 8 people, I sort of designed it for 4 because that was more or less how many people I can get at once. I think the most people I was able to draft this with was 6, and we played like 2-3 player pods. But it has 1,080 cards because if it is drafted with 8 people, that's already 800 cards that are being drafted.
Oh my gosh! I've never built a cube that big. Wow, I have nothing but admiration for you. What an undertaking!
Yeah, thank you. It's quite rewarding. Also, at least at the point where I'm at, everything is just fine tuning. I twist a screw here, I dust off a spring there, check a nail, but it's something that, for example, like we mentioned earlier about limitations. If I want the players drafting my cube to be able to build a 100 card singleton color identity respecting bona fide commander deck, they have to draft at the very minimum 100 cards and then put in the basics as they see fit. So and if I want 8 people, it has to be, well, at the very minimum 800 cards. But then I want a little bit of variance because, as I mentioned earlier, if you have same players vying for the same archetype, they might not find all the pieces or whatever. So I wanted to boost it up. Oh, let me boost it up maybe like 200 more to have a bit of variance. And not just variance, but there are a lot of fun cards that are drafting cards that you don't see in Constructed. For example, Conspiracy brought a lot of cards that add extra booster packs to a draft. Or there's an uncard booster tutor that lets you get a pack from outside. So that pack that you quote unquote get from outside is just an extra pack for my cube. Or there's another uncard from Unstable that does the same thing, that you grab a booster pack and then all the creatures in it, you put them in your hand. So I also have it not just for the variation, but those, interesting cards that let you add packs to the draft or let you add packs in a game. So you need extra packs. But yeah, it's quite an undertaking. A 1080 cube. It's my baby. What can I say?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, for me, in a more traditional and draft environment where you're not doing awesome special things like you're talking about, for me personally, 450 I've discovered is my sweet spot because 450 it's bigger than 360, which means that in an 8-player pod, not every card is going to be drafted. So it's introducing some variance, but nevertheless, it's still a quite, self-contained, relatively small environment. So I've got a huge amount of control over the environment, but also people are seeing some different cards, and it makes more mystery even in gameplay because when every single card is opened, you know that somebody has card X. Like somebody saw card X because every single card was drafted, and maybe it's not this opponent who has it, and maybe it's not in their main deck, maybe it's in their side, but like somebody has this card. But the more cards you add, the more uncertainty you create around that, and that's fun too. That's part of this, creating some variance like we were talking about.
Yeah, because then it becomes like, and I like these kinds of like drafting games like Sushi Go and all that stuff. And it becomes a point where, okay, I saw this card, it came back around, I don't see it anymore, right? Someone picked it, and then you're sort of trying to guess who's building what deck, and it sort of adds like another dimension. Maybe it's a dimension you don't want in your cube, or maybe it is a dimension you want in your cube where you have that element of, guessing what you're facing before you face it. So that's why I also like, the variety, because like you mentioned, not everything is picked or seen, and that's also good for the replayability. Like, for example, if every card is always seen every single time, then the novelty might wear off of what your cube is.
Yeah, right. I'm totally with you. I agree. This is also a reason why I appreciate. I mean, I think we should have archetypes broadly in a cube, but also, I, at least personally, try to shy away from having on rails experiences, right? I'm not a super fan of that. So, for instance, tribal oriented decks, I'm not big on having a cube that's just like a tribal cube.
Oh yeah, same.
That can be fun, and that's awesome if that's what you're into, and I don't want to hate on that at all. But just for me personally, the more you move in certain directions, the more on rails the draft experience can feel, whereby somebody's like, okay, I'm picking goblins. So like anything that says goblin now, I'm picking it. And that can be a lot of fun, but it can also get to be repetitive over some length of time where you're playing that cube. So
yeah, it might seem automated also, like you're just picking it because you have to pick it. That's also an archetype I avoided by the simple, pragmatic nature of what I wanted. Because let's say you do pick, a commander that's, I don't know, Merfolk tribal, right? But then there's so many cards that are going through. Maybe people pick that Merfolk just because it's good value, but then you're left without Merfolks. And then if I do have Merfolk, or if I have goblins, or if I add other tribes, then it becomes an even bigger mess. So I think that's probably the only archetype I would not have in the cube ever. I don't think I ever had it, and it's just the pragmatic nature of it. It's sort of forcing the player into a direction the moment they pick their first card, and that's not something I want. Because let's say you pick one archetype, but since there are overlapping synergies, maybe you're playing ETB, but then tokens, because maybe some creatures enter the battlefield and create tokens, or maybe some spells create tokens. So there's like some overlap there. But if I'm just picking goblins, I'm not going to care about those ETB cards or those token cards. I care about anything that will support my tribal, archetype. And that's just something I avoid for the same reasons you mentioned. Right.
And this goes back to a point you were making when you were talking about Brago a little bit ago. Like, I'm totally with you that you want to find ways of bridging different possible archetypes So ETB creatures, these value-oriented ETB creatures, these are super useful to blink archetypes, to reanimator archetypes, to things that are, I mean, other ways of sneaking stuff into play. And also, they tend to be just good creatures on their own often, right? I mean, I guess here I'm sort of alluding to this old distinction between Baneslayers and Mulldrifters, where Baneslayers are big, impactful creatures that may affect the board, but they don't bring along extra value with them necessarily, except in as much as what they themselves can do, like their stats and their abilities on board. A Mulldrifter may be a less impressive card in terms of its stats, but it's something that brings value to the table immediately, right? Like it draws you 2 cards or whatever. Or it's got this additional flexibility as Mulldrifter does, and that it can be evoked and whatever. Anyway, all I'm saying is something like a Mulldrifter, you don't have to build a deck around a Mulldrifter to have a Mulldrifter be a good card in your deck.
Exactly.
Right? Like a Mulldrifter can just be a good card. But then if you're doing Reanimator stuff or you're doing Flicker stuff, Mulldrifter is a super awesome card in each of those cases. So I'm definitely I love finding ways of finding bridges between different archetypes so that you can be making these things gel in unusual and maybe unexpected ways sometimes, and finding the glue that's going to hold all these different possible constellations of archetypes together.
Yes, it's the versatility. Like Mulldrifter, I'm glad you said it, is such a great example of such a versatile card, because I can pick it just for value. It draws me cards.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have to have picked Brago or Yarok. I just, okay, I got Mulldrifter. If I happen to have a Reanimator, awesome. Maybe I can use Hell's Caretaker to reanimate it or animate dead, whatever. Or maybe I have a Sacrifice archetype where maybe I also drafted Martyr's Bond. So if I evoke Mulldrifter, now the whole table has to sacrifice a creature. It's such a versatile card that depending on what you pick is how you use it. Those are the best cards, I think, should go like when you're designing cubes. Once you reach that elevated level of, okay, I want to try and have everything be as efficient as possible, which, honestly is never going to always happen 100%. But I would always pick the Mulldrifter over Baneslayer Angel, because it can go anywhere. Even if it does nothing else, then draw you the cards, awesome. Or if it's later in the game and you can use it as a flyer to bother someone's face, perfect. It's just the perfect card.
Yep. It is, yeah, I'm totally with you. I much prefer that model of card to the Baneslayer Angel model of card. And if you love Baneslayer Angel, that's great. Good on you. But I'm happy that increasingly over time we're getting more and more flexible cards. This has been a design trend of late, and WotC's pushed this in super interesting directions, I think, with like the MDFC, the modal dual face cards, and with stuff like, I don't know, adventure,
for sure,
that let cards be a spell, like an instant or a sorcery, and then also be a creature, or artifact, anyway. WotC's experimenting with lots of different ways of shoehorning more value into cards and increasing the flexibility in the ways that cards can be used, and I love that, not only as a cube designer, but just also as a player. These are exactly the kind of cards I want to be drafting and putting into my decks.
Yeah, and even simple things like, for example, Krosan Tusker, where you can cycle it away for 2 colorless and a green, but when you cycle it, you search your library for a basic land card and you put it in your hand. So not only are you drawing a card, but you're also getting a land in your hand. So you're getting 2 cards from discarding it for 2 and a green, and let's say you were in that Reanimator, now you can get a 6/5 afterwards.
Yeah.
Or like Greater Tanuki, which does the same thing pretty much. Those are the cards I love.
Oh, yeah. I'm totally with you. It bins itself. That's amazing. And in so I love cycling, full stop. And in years ago now, there used to be more discourse around a style of deck in Type 2 that was called a Xerox deck, where this was a control deck that had lots of cards that replaced themselves.
Yeah.
The idea is in an inexpensive way. So cards with cycling are just cards like, Ponder and Preordain and stuff like that lets you see more cards and pick the cards you want. So the more cards that you have that allow you to tear through the deck, the easier it is for you to find the key cards that you need in order to win the game.
Yeah.
And this also allows you to do things. Stuff like cycling lets you hold up mana for your counter magic or whatever you got, and then if you don't need to use it, then you've got other stuff to do with your mana on the opponent's turn.
Yeah, exactly.
I love these kinds of I love these kinds of cards. I try to put tons of inexpensive cantrips into my cubes, and I like I've got a cube that's called a lower powered sort of master's power level cube called Petty Nobility, and this is a kind of Jenny Johnny playground environment, more than like a super spiky cube where you're trying to assemble cool combos and stuff. And in that cube, I've got expensive green creatures, as a person is likely to have in green, but almost every single one of them is something that, as you're describing, you can cycle away. So Greater Tanuki and Rampaging Hippo, Greater Sandworm,
Titanoth Rex.
Tuxer. Yeah, Titanoth Rex, absolutely. Even something like Woodland Bellower, I think, is the last big card I have in there, and that doesn't cycle away, but it's something that brings additional value. It's a kind of Mole Drifter in expensive green, because it lets you tutor for another green card that is cheaper and put it on the battlefield. Anyway, these cards are useful in all the ways you described for binning them and so on, but also, and super relevantly, I think, you can imagine a hand where you've got that Crows and Tusker in your opening hand, and like you're just not getting to 7 mana for some length of time. So it's amazing that you can just pitch the card, whether you care to reanimate it or not.
Exactly.
Right? And just draw a new card, and in fact get a basic land and whatever. That's great that the card has such flexibility. I love it.
Yeah, because like you mentioned earlier with the Entomb, you don't pick Crows and Tusker with the expectation to reanimate it later on. You pick it because it's going to be good early game, it's going to be good late game, but if you so happen to be able to reanimate it because you're picking those pieces, then it's even better. It's never dead. It's good or great or awesome. It's never bad or dead.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so I've got some dorky cards that I'm totally happy to play with. So I don't know, like Striped Riverwinder is a card from Amonkhet block that's 6 and a blue for a 5/5 with hexproof, and like that's it. And it's not an exciting card, right? A 7 mana 5/5, but it's got cycling for a single blue. So I think of this card as a cantrip, really. Like the majority of the time that I'm playing this card, it's an instant speed, uncounterable card that just replaces itself. And I'm delighted with that. But if I draw that card late in the game and I don't have anything else to do, right, I can dump 7 mana into it and I got a 5/5 hexproof big dorky thing, and that's awesome.
It's your control win con, beater.
Yeah, right.
It's like once you reach that point in the game where the opponent like reset all their resources because you're countering whatever, okay, boom, 7. And it's there.
Yeah, this is true.
Going maybe back a little bit to philosophy, right? Because it always boils down to philosophy, right? And how you go with a group. So, while cubes are meant to share its, curator's vision and philosophy, as well as the preferences with a group, because you always build it with a group. But that also essentially means that it's just all one single person's cards being publicly used, right? So changing the conversation a bit, the theme of it, that's a bit of a scare also for some people. For example, others are using my cards, so that's also one maybe hurdle for some people when it comes to building cubes. You know what I mean? So in that aspect, like, what tips can you give, for that psychologically dealing, with people handling your cards, shuffling your cards, or playing with your own cards, because maybe it's not always a play group. It might be strangers, maybe you took your cube to an LGS, to a convention, because you're not always going to have 7 buddies hanging around. Maybe you go to an LGS with 2 or 3 friends, and then the rest of the draft is with strangers. So, how do you deal with that? Because at least for me, like, my fear is people, maybe swiping some cards or ruining them in some way, and you not really knowing until maybe you get home or you count the cards afterwards. So that at least is a fear for me. So I'm imagining that's probably a fear shared by other people. What kind of advice, because I know you've hulked around your cubes to conventions and places like that. Like, what insight can you give towards that, darker side of cube curation?
Right. Yeah, that's a real concern for sure. I think there's a few different, as you're describing quite well, there's a few different concerns people can have, even outside of people wandering off with cards. One might have some anxiety about people handling the cards or being rough with the cards, and I totally get that. And I've learned I've learned to mitigate some problems over time. Like in my initial cube back in 2011, I'd sleeved the cube, but I hadn't double sleeved the cube. And we had, so a bunch of friends and I were playing, and we had a nice bottle of rye whiskey on the table that we were enjoying. Yeah, and then, of course, the thing happened that, of course, was going to happen, and somebody knocked over the nice bottle of rye. And it was a disaster, right? So whiskey got into all of the, not everything, but many of the cards were very badly damaged because single sleeving provided some protection, but not ton. So then after that, I started double sleeving stuff, as I should have been doing in the first instance. So you can definitely take precautions along those lines to help protect your valuable cards from greasy fingers and from rye whiskey and so on. So by all means, double sleeve. So that's one thing. But I guess another thing is, if you're not comfortable taking your cube and sharing your cube with a particular group of people, then I don't even know if that is a psychological problem that you need to overcome, in my book. Like, if you're not comfortable taking it to that Grand Prix or whatever we're calling them these days, then I wouldn't take it. Like, you're going to be having less fun at the convention because you're going to be like stressed out about your cards. So I just wouldn't put myself through that. If that's going to be yourself, if that's going to stress you out, then I just wouldn't do it. So maybe you just play with friends and people you trust, and that's how you interact with it. I'm organizing CubeCon in Madison in October 20th through 23rd, 2022. I'm one of the people putting together this big thing. And we've got, I don't remember the exact number, something like, I think we've got 29 cubes in our main event.
Wow.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome.
Because
it's going to be so much.
I've been seeing it promoted for so long. Like, I saw it promoted on your channel. I saw it promoted on the Discord for Cube Cobra. I saw it promoted. I don't remember where else I saw it promoted, but I'm like, I think on Twitter also. And that's pretty much where my question was at, because I'm like, oh, that could be awesome. Like if I were to be able to go, I'd like to take mine just to have, people who are really into the cube community check it out and see and all that. But then in my mind, it's like, oh, I'm going by myself. Like how do these cube curators deal with that? At least it's an anxiety that I feel. But it's like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna take, my cube and present it here at the convention and play with strangers, because it's not necessarily an LGS. You're going to CubeCon to draft with cubes, right? It's not, the convention's cube. It's a guest's cube or some attendee's cube. So in that sense, I'm trying to keep my own cube budget for that very reason. Like, even though it has 1,080 cards, the secondary value of my cube is less than $2,000. And even then, once a card passes the $10 threshold, because every year cards increase in price, I'm like, okay, it's over $10 now. I take it out, and maybe some other card I wanted to put in from this new set. That's usually what I do. Like if I see a new card from a new set, I'm like, okay, let's see what are the expensive cards that are, coming up in price. Because sometimes I see people flex, and that's where my worry comes from. I was like, oh, I have this foil Liliana of the Veil in my cube, and I'm like, ugh, like I like if that's your jam, cool, but like that's too much anxiety for me just to have other people handle, the expensive cardboard, to put it that way.
Yes, I totally understand that, and I brought up CubeCon not only because it's an awesome time and people should come, but also just to say that we're struggling with precisely these issues that you're describing as convention organizers. So I can say a few things about how we're approaching this issue of ensuring people's cubes, some ways we've been thinking about this. So thing number one is we've got a main event area and we've got a free play area. And in the main event, we have a relationship with WotC. So we, as part of the is one of the requirements of having a relationship with WotC, we're not allowed to have any proxies in any of the main event cubes. Everything has to be real magic cards, and fair enough. In the free play area, though, anything goes, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess do with this what you will. I don't encourage anybody to do one thing or not the other thing, or to undercut anybody's business model or whatever. But there are ways that you might be able to reduce your feeling of risk with your cards, if that's something that you're on board with and that other people are on board with as well. We can't do that in the main event cubes, but in the side event stuff in the free play area, that's totally fine. In the main event, we're going to have a system whereby we've got checklists that we'll have printed out and can give people, or that we may be doing through an app actually. But this is a thing you could use Cube Cobra or something like that, right? So you've got your cube list there, and you could print out a checklist and then have people register their decks. This is something you're super concerned about, right?
Like back in the day,
Like back in the day, right? And then you can verify this if you want, or you could do something like have players in the pod pass their decks and deck lists to another player in the pod and have them
cross-check it.
Have another, exactly, right. Have people verify the registration, and then at the end of the matches, at the end of the experience, people can check their decks back in, right? And you can go through and make sure everything's there. So that's another, for me, this isn't something that I ever do when I'm playing with friends.
Of course, it's friends.
Yeah, right, exactly. But if you're going to a convention or you're going to CubeCon or something, and I can totally understand having these kinds of concerns. So there are ways that you might be able to mitigate the possibility of loss by having some additional checks in place like this.
And that's actually sounds simple too. I mean, it's like, renting out shoes at the bowling alley or skates at the skating rink. Like, you give back the skates and you get back your shoes. So right. it only makes sense that if you're taking out cards, you give the cards back.
Right. Yeah, that's very true.
Well, that's interesting. I'm glad you brought it up, because I knew you guys had some relation with WotC, because I know, for example, one of your cubes was featured on MTGO, right? Some time ago, I think maybe 2 or 1 year ago, more or less, right?
It was, May of 2020. So it was a little over it was over 2 years ago now. Wow, it's been a little bit.
Yeah, because I remember seeing that, like, awesome. Like, you have your cube there on MTGO for everybody to check it out. At least one of your cubes, because I know you got a couple, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was a great experience. And the coolest thing about it, from my perspective, is this took some doing, but I was able to get data from WotC, play data.
Oh, wow.
And, there's like tens of thousands of people, I don't remember the numbers, of people who played that cube. And WotC, of course, as you would expect, collects all this data about how people are interacting with the cube. And so they didn't give me everything, but they gave me a substantial amount of data, with the caveat that I wasn't allowed to share the spreadsheet. I wasn't allowed to share the raw data that they gave me with people, but I could talk about it and I could summarize it. I just couldn't be like, I couldn't provide specific numbers. But nevertheless, it was this treasure trove, even if it was redacted when they gave it to me. And so here's a little plug for the Cultic Cube channel.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, plug away everything, man. Feel free.
Thank you. I produced a series of 4 videos analyzing that data with friends who are better mathematicians and statisticians and computer scientists than I am. And so that was my favorite part of the experience, because I just learned so much from not only watching people around the world play the cube and like visiting people's streams and things where people are doing it, but then also getting this enormous amount of data from WotC.
Yeah, because even something as simple as always seeing like first pick or second pick, that gives so much information as to what players' preferences are, because if you're seeing that some cards are picked always 6th or 7th, that's telling you something super important. Like, maybe you like the card, but if no one's picking it, it's because maybe it's not in the appropriate environments, it's not getting the support and stuff like that. So, I mean, that's invaluable, especially from WotC, because like you mentioned, it's from all over the world, getting that information.
Yeah, right. And like win percentages and things. So I got this pretty granular data about how often people like match win rates when card X is in a deck.
Yeah.
Right. So that's fascinating too. And then, as you say, data concerning when that card is picked, like at what point in a draft any given card is picked, and then you can sort of map these two things onto each other and see which are the winningest cards, which are the losingest cards, and how those cards are valued, and whether that value is justified or whether they're being, overvalued or undervalued or whatever. And there were tons of surprises. Like, this was hot on the heels of Oko coming out.
Oh, yeah.
And, we all know Oko's a broken card.
Yep.
And Oko was picked extraordinarily highly. It turned out Oko wasn't an especially winning card in the environment, and people were including him in decks. I mean, the conclusion was, I think, people were probably overvaluing him to such an extent that they're shoehorning him into decks where he didn't belong, and they were trying probably to stretch mana bases in a way that was lowering their win percentage, even if in order to put what they understood to be a very high performing card into the deck. Anyway, it was super cool. It was awesome. I loved it.
Yeah, that's the beauty of Cube also, like you mentioned, is like, Oko's broken, but if in the environment you're drafting it, it's not a super powerful card, why go for colors, or why splash colors you don't need just for the occasional elking something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very true.
Wow, that's a that's a great experience. Being able to have that, bridge with the company that makes the cards and with a computer program where you're getting, basically limitless information to help you out.
Yeah.
Especially at least with that cube in particular, because obviously I think that was the one that was featured amongst your other cubes, but that still gives you an idea then of how you can work with the other ones, right?
Yeah, right. That's true. So yeah, it was great. There's a lot of lessons I learned from that experience. This is an experience that I had in the past, and that a lot of people are able to have. So I think it's important that people get lots of different kinds of feedback from themselves and from their players in lots of different ways. So we don't get to draft any given cube tens of thousands of times in the way that WotC's like holiday vintage cube or whatever is going to be drafted tens of thousands of times, and we don't have access to that kind of data. And so we want to see how people are interacting with the cube and the feedback that they have for us about the cube. For me, it's important to talk to my players and get their impressions. And I may not do all the things my players want me to do necessarily.
Yeah.
Because people can be bad about giving advice sometimes.
That's true, and you're not always going to get the best players either.
And right. And people can have a bad experience or a good experience in a way that isn't typical. But I still very much want to watch what people are doing and get feedback from people. But I want to collect data in lots of other different ways as well. So we talked about just like drafting our own environments, just like sitting there and drafting. That's not going to be the same thing as drafting it and playing it, but it's still a way that we can generate a lot of data, a lot of interesting and hopefully useful data for ourselves that don't require getting the whole band together and having, spending some hours drafting and playing the cube. So.
And even then, if you're the creator and you have people with you, there is always some point of view that you're missing. For example, even when, like, let's say you're a video game developer, you know how the game goes, but you give it to beta testers because they probably find something broken that you didn't know was ever broken or you didn't expect. Like, I highly doubt Nintendo expected Breath of the Wild to be beatable in like 25 minutes, but here we are, right? So having the more amount of people you have playing it, the more things you can find, because if you have these findings that you didn't expect, you can work around with it, and it leads to new discovery. And obviously, I'm going to be biased to that because I'm a mathematician. So anytime I see charts and data and numbers and all that, that's always interesting to me. So I'm always hooked with those kinds of things.
Right. Yeah. It's super exciting. I love that kind of stuff. And I think that people, I think people could use a greater comfortability with and felicity with math than they may have sometimes. So there's lots of tools that can be extremely useful that I've talked about, and I'm sure you've talked about in places as well, like hypergeometric analysis. Hypergeometric probability is a way of figuring out all manner of things, from how many lands you may want in a deck in order to hit reliably, X number of lands and Y number of turns.
Yeah, that was a great video. I don't remember exactly who you invited on that video, but I remember that they were mentioning, for example, if you're playing White Weenie and you want to see how much support you would have to give it, the hypergeometric calculator can help you out with that, because you want to, be playing on curve because that's the archetype you want. That was a great video.
Yes. Yeah, so that's useful. It's useful not only in figuring out things about your deck in order to make your deck function in the way that you're hoping it functions, But this is useful for cube designers too,
Mm-hmm.
to ensure that things like archetypes are adequately supported. So as you say, if you want to make sure that you really have enough support for White Weenie, given the number of cards in your cube and the number of drafters you expect to have and the cards that they're going to be seeing, right? Like here's how many 1-drops, here's how many white 1-drop creatures that are aggressive that that I want to have in the cube to ensure that this is going to be a real thing. So that's that's extremely valuable. There's all these tools that I think are underused because, I mean, this is speculation on my part, but I think some people have this kind of mystical relationship to magic, which is fine if that's what if that's what you want to do, whereby they feel like things should just be able to intuit their way to the correct complement of different things, right? To the correct like recipe for their deck or for the cube. And if that's what you want to do and that's what works for you, that's awesome. But there are lots and lots of other tools available to us as well that can help supplement our intuitive sense of what works and give us a more data-driven approach that can be very helpful.
Oh, for sure. It's like a hesitation because even like we mentioned, Cube Cobra, again, amazing site. I can't plug it enough. If you see all of like the analysis you can do with your cube, that might seem overwhelming for a lot of people because you have all these averages and you have tables and you have charts and you can even, look at bot data and all that stuff. But it's more simpler than you can, if you just have to like delve in a little bit deeper into it to reach a point where it's not necessarily completing your cube, but you're fine tuning it to a point where you're satisfied enough where the next things will be, okay, I like these new cards. How can I slot them in? You know what I mean? But the baseline has reached a point where it's there. Like if you did absolutely nothing more to it, which obviously is unreal. We're always updating our cubes. But assuming you decide to keep it in a time capsule, it's going to always be good. And those tools they're good. They're not that difficult to use. So I hope to maybe one day, go over all those tools a little bit calmly, but I'm glad that you did that episode with the hypergeometric calculator because even though that seems super advanced, the way it was presented was simple enough where you're using the metrics and you want to see if it's possible or not. You can't just have a gut feeling, oh, let me see if it's possible. Sure, you can try it, but then what's going to happen? Your play group experience is going to prove it. Someone was trying to draft White Weenie and they didn't win a single game because they didn't get any of the support cards for it, or they couldn't play on curve for it. So it also helps in that sense to sort of foreshadow or prepare yourself for like problem solving before it reaches the testing phase.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, so after I made that video about the hypergeometric, sorry, I just clicked on a video. After I made that video about using the hypergeometric calculator as a tool for cube design, I was talking with our friend Gwen Decker, the Cube Cobra guy, about this, and he built a hypergeometric calculator into Cube Cobra, right? So it's like right there. You go to the analysis tab, and then here's the thing. And he's got a little paragraph blurb about how to use it, and he's got a link, which I believe links to my video, which is awesome. I didn't know or hadn't remembered that he'd done that. So the tools are like right there and baked into Cobra. You don't even have to go anywhere else at this point, because in the video I was talking about like going to this other website and using these tools, So
that's the website I would use for opening hands and stuff, because I made an interesting video for someone else for Mons from CDH-TV. He asked me the question, how likely is this to happen? I'm like, you know what? I can give you the exact answer. And now it's on Cube Cobra, and it's great. And what I like about it is, just as we've been conversing and progressing, from the more basics to the more higher level stuff like math, the way it's on Cube Cobra, if you notice, it's also in the same way. Like the most basic averages, how many things you have in your cube in the total, correlation. Then the table, you can see it. Then you have a chart, you can see it even better. And then you can play around with what you want to see in the chart in terms of color, mana curve, the more basic stuff. And then you have, the playtest data, which again, you're seeing all the bot data. And then as you keep going, then you finally reach the higher level stuff like the pivot table and the hypergeometric calculator. So it's sort of like the natural evolution of how you tinker with your cube until you little by little, get where you want to get it to.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It is nice how they give us more accessible data, like things like averages, which should be, very intuitive for people to grasp. Anybody with, just a little bit of math knowledge is going to understand that. And then it gets maybe progressively more complicated, and you can go along for the ride as long as you want, or you can jump ship at whatever point makes sense to you. So you can engage with these details or not as you like.
Yeah, it's super. It's just, what I like is that while a lot of people try and steer clear away from, but that's too formulaic, I think in a sense it's not really formulaic. It's like you're investing your time in your work. Like, you're not doing it on a whim or from intuition. You might do it on intuition, that's fine, and then you can, figure it out as you go along. But it's not like you mentioned earlier, some people are very purist and they say you have to have X% of this, you have to have X% of that. That to me is way more formulaic and constricting than you simply using mathematical tools to like smoothen out any rough edges you have. It's not forcing you into the confines of a rule set. You're still within your rules and your own confinement of, what you want your cube to be, but you're just smoothing it out. Maybe this card is too high a CMC, but maybe you can find a similar effect for a lower CMC, and that, helps out your curve a little bit more. Or you can add this or this or that, It's just a matter of like smoothing it out.
Yeah, I mean, it's just more data. It's another way of understanding the cube. It's more knowledge about the cube. And just like we were saying before, maybe you take suggestions from your players that seem like awesome suggestions and helpful, and maybe sometimes you don't take suggestions from your players, and you're working through these things in your own mind. You're doing this calculus about what's going to make the environment best for you. These data-driven tools that Cube Cobra offers that we're talking about, these are data points, right? And so maybe you don't have to do anything with them, but I think at least for me, my knowledge of the environment is richer for having access to them.
Yeah, of course, 100%. Like I was mentioning, even for me, like I don't expect the bot, because the bots will never draft my cube as if they're building a commander deck. But at the same time, the bots will pick within certain colors. Like, very rarely a bot's going to pick 5 colors. But if a bot's picking 2 or 3 colors because it's understanding that can adapt it, then I'm just going to assume it picked a 3-colored commander, right? So even then, the bots are still useful for me. The bots is just assuming it just has this massive pool for which to build a 40-card deck. But it's still giving me information, like what is the bot seeing? Like, is the bot seeing some overlapping strategies, because the bots usually go for that. So that's also helpful in mine. Like, are they able to build within the archetype? Maybe the bot was, maybe the bot wasn't. So even something as simple as that is helpful. Like, I'm not going to just, destroy the data or ignore it, but it helps me. It helps me see at least a little bit, okay, yeah, maybe I can support it a bit more. Or maybe, I can do a little bit of, seeing the averages and see if it helps. Because my averages, for example, for mana color is all the same. Because like I mentioned, I have to have, it can't be lopsided. So those percentages don't really help me out. But the mana curve, 100%, it helps me out. Like, I know in terms of color, everything is exact. But in terms of CMC, okay, that's super helpful. I'm okay on curve. So I know that I can't cut too many low cards for high cards like we mentioned earlier. But I don't need to be a mathematician to know that. Like you mentioned, it's visual. You see it. It's tangible.
Right.
You can see, I have 100 6 CMC cards and only 10 1 CMC cards. That's not, then there should be more meat there.
Right, for sure. Yeah, that's cool. Those are great tools. And then people have done other stuff with this data that has been made accessible by the website too. Like you probably know Andy Mangold and Anthony Maddox of Lucky Paper Radio. They made this cube visualization cloud map.
Oh, that's super cool.
Yeah, it's a really cool thing. People, if they're interested, should go to, I don't know, the Lucky Paper website. I don't know the address offhand, luckypapermtg.com, and you can find this cube map, and it's created these a sort of geography of cubes, and you can search for individual cubes and find them on there. You can find your own cube. And this is not only fascinating, you can like zoom in and out of these different continents and islands. It's beautiful, and I love it.
That's super cool.
Yeah, and it's extremely helpful to designers as well, I think, because you can see what you can. If you find your own cube, you can find cubes that are on your island that are very similar in design, or more or less similar in design, right? And then you can click on these points and go explore those cubes and see what other people who have similar design goals have done. Maybe you'll find some hot new tech, from other people. It's really neat.
Yeah, that's super useful because great minds think alike, but like we mentioned earlier, maybe you're not seeing the whole picture because you're only looking at it from one dimension.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And it can be hard to find like-minded designers or similar cubes, especially if you're not like super plugged into the community. But even if you are, like, this is a programmatic way that these people have developed for establishing similarities between cubes, and then it just puts this menu at your disposal of all the cubes on Cube Cobra. It allows you to explore them in a way that's not just like randomly clicking on some random cube.
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons I started like my mini series on Commander cubes, because obviously there's a lot of really useful information on cubes, and every year there's more and more stuff, right? Because obviously the internet doesn't erase what it has from 5 years ago. But when I started with my Commander cube, most of the research I found was just on basic, cube stuff, which is still helpful because it's a good base, but maybe I saw like 3 or 4, like at max, or maybe 5 videos total on YouTube about it. Like I scoured the internet. Not a lot of guides out there. So I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to do one from my experience, after a couple of years working with it, because I like to be helpful too. Is like, I learned things from others, so I would like others to learn things from me too. That's why, I reached out to try and do this video, so that I've covered things so hyper specifically within a niche that I felt like it was good to try and broaden out and have maybe something better for the base, which I'm pretty sure we've probably covered a lot of those bases so far. Yeah, awesome. I was gonna say that because I think we covered more or less everything. Like the only question I think I would have left to ask is that, for example, you mentioned like just the tiniest of dabbling in Commander, right? So have you played Commander at least more often than not?
I've played some, but really very little. So when the first Commander precons came out, whenever that was, maybe 2013 or something, I got a Mimeoplasm precon. And so I played that some. This was in Sultai colors, I guess. Yeah. So I played that a little bit with friends, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. Although I was often playing with just one other person, which is sort of like not the EDH way.
Yeah, exactly.
Typically, right? So it didn't make a lot of sense in some ways. So that was like most of my experience there. And then I was designing cube at this point, and I got the itch to like take the deck apart and start using components of it for for cubes.
Yeah, that makes sense because it's your jam. But in that sense, have you ever, for example, played multiplayer cubes or designed one?
Yeah, well, I haven't designed one. That'd be a fun challenge that you're an expert at, clearly. I have played these sometimes, and it is a whole other ball game. I can totally see the charm of it. It's just a very different way of experiencing Magic. Multiplayer Magic is because there's you know better than I. There's a whole raft of new considerations like the diplomacy of the table, which just changes the texture of the game enormously. So that's not the way that I've typically played Magic, but I can totally respect people for whom this is really part of the charm of the game, that social and sort of political element of it.
Yeah, in that sense, right? For more or less to try and bridge everything together with like a final question. From your expertise in this 1v1 Magic, which admittedly it's been forever since I've played dedicated 1v1, like I only do it for pre-releases. Knowing how much work it is for Cube, you are drafting it with multiple people, but then you're like bracketing people off tourney style, right? 1v1. Do you think, or how do you think it would be in terms of differences? Would it be super different? Would there only be slight tweaks? If you were to design a cube with multiplayer in mind, and not so much specifically not so much generally multiplayer, but like if you're really focused on it having to be multiplayer, how big that gap do you think would be?
That's a really good question, and one that I imagine you would have much better answers to and more experienced answers to. So I'll tell you what my initial knee-jerk reactions to that are, and then you can tell me how you feel about this, because I'd love to hear about it. But I think that in a multiplayer setting, aggro is going to go down in value. It's going to be a sort of different it's going to be a different beast, because you're not just like pounding to 20 with your lightning bolts anymore when you've got 3 opponents instead of 1 opponent. So I would imagine that either the curve goes up and or emphasis shifts away from the bottom of the curve, and at least in a purely aggressive sense. You still, things like a Goblin Welder or whatever is still going to be a great 1-drop, presumably. But Goblin Guide is not going to be as good a 1-drop anymore.
Exactly.
So that's going to be a change, and obviously cards that can affect multiple opponents, that say all of your opponents lose a life or something. Like clearly that goes way up in value compared to, destroy target creature or whatever. And things that control the board are always important in my book, but they're going to increase in value as well, probably. Like I'm thinking of things like wraths. Right?
Yep. No, 100%. You wouldn't be wrong. In that sense, what I mentioned earlier, archetypes, what would happen in a multiplayer setting is that you have to basically ignore one archetype altogether. For example, in a multiplayer setting, particularly, for example, in Commander, we have like the Voltron archetype where you're beefing up one creature, and then go headhunting. But if you want to go, for example, aggro, you're not going to do it with, fast 1-drops. You'd probably do it by swarming the board with tokens. So you could have sort of that aggro strategy, but you have to combine it with tokens, right? Or if you go aggro, you hyperfixate maybe on one creature. And like you mentioned, yes, controlling the board, those are obviously the best effects. Like usually, if you see board wipes in your pack, it might not be your first pick, but if it comes back around, then that's probably your second pick. And it also has to do with, well, if I pick it and it's a global board wipe, I'll just let the other player handle it. And politics will then come into it. because I didn't pick the Wrath of God. But if the other player next to me picked it and they played it, it was still maybe beneficial to me. So there, there's that risk of also in how you're drafting it. So I think, that is an interesting change in philosophy, how you go about it. Like you mentioned, like you have to then start thinking about other archetypes and the strength of other cards, because maybe Wrath of God is not that powerful in 1v1, but Wrath of God is like all-star, right? In a multiplayer setting.
Right. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And this does figure into a larger question, I think, of how people things when you get to a certain point with your cube, whatever kind of cube it is, you're going to want to think about how you're balancing certain kinds of effects given the goals that you have in the environment. So if you have an environment where you're really invested in people building cool Rube Goldberg machines, the Jenny Johnny kind of environment, then you need to be very wary about the board wipe effects that you're giving people access to, right? Because it can be a feel bad if you've got a bunch of Wrath of Gods in the cube and people are putting all this work into building their cool machine, and then it just gets negated at a stroke like that. So there are effects like that. There's also considerations like the kind and the quality of ramp that you're giving people access to.
Exactly.
That is going to just massively change the texture of how any given game is going to play out. So these are all sort of more advanced questions, but there's questions like this to keep in the back of one's head as one's continuing to refine the cube.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. That's why, like I mentioned earlier, it's although I appreciate all the work, the cube community as a whole have done with providing so many tools and resources for people either starting with a cube or wanting to, fine tune their cube. Since Commander is a whole different beast in every single way of the word, like the format adds additional rules to the game, like something that simple. And not just from deck construction, but how you play it. And then it's also multiplayer. That additional dimension creates a gap that was large enough where I'm like, okay, I'm not finding enough resources. I'll just wing it. And then, with my experience and what I know about the game, I'll be able to fine tune it later. And that's what I've enjoyed so far, like just combining the two ways I've loved to play Magic, which is, that draftable format along with Commander. So hopefully, other people who are interested in either dimension of the thing can see that it's not separate. You can mix it and basically do whatever you want, which is the moral of the story. Like, sure, like you're helping me present this sort of general guide on, maybe from start to quote unquote finish, but at the end of the day, you're your monster's master. You build, you're a Frankenstein, however you want to build it.
Right. That's very true. And that's such a fine exhortation to people to take the ways that they love playing Magic and make them work together and create something new and something original that they love and that they're going to love sharing with people, just as you've done. That's awesome.
Yeah. So I'm super grateful for having you on, because you're obviously, and I'm going to plug everything I can in the description and all that. But there are some really important tips. Like I mentioned, even though mine is super specific to a point where it's a niche in a niche, the starting point is going to always be the same. You're going to sit down, you're going to have a pile of cards thrown everywhere, and from there it begins. And then wherever it ends, it's up to you.
Yeah, that's great. This is true.
All right, so thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully, everything runs smoothly in CubeCon. I might not be able to go, but I'm super pumped for you and for your team and everything you guys will be doing over there. So hopefully anybody listening who's interested in going can check it out. Do you have any other ways? Well, I mean, you can tell me later any other ways people can check out, the convention and all that, so I can plug it into the description as well.
Yeah, people should, if people are interested, they should go to mtgcubecon.com. So that's our website. We do have, ticket sales are available. They're up. we've got people buying tickets. It's super exciting. And it's happening October 20th through 23rd, 2022. I'm really stoked. I'll just say one other small thing I'm excited about is
yeah, sure.
There's also going to be this conference aspect to it too. So we're going to have roundtable talks, and we're going to be talking about just the kinds of things that you and I have been chatting about today. We're going to be chatting about cube design and cube gameplay strategy and stuff. It's going to be super cool. And we're just going to be playing a lot of cube.
That's awesome. So it's basically a whole day thing for those days, right?
Mm-hmm. It is, yeah. It's 4 days long, and it'll culminate we'll cut to a top 64 and then top 8 on the last day in the main event, but people are still going to be, cubing and so on, but it'll be fun. It'll be fun to see people, the highest level players, there cubing in that top 8. But it's going to be a really good time, and we've got such a huge variety of cubes, from more traditional cubes to really wacky cubes like unset cubes, or ones that just have funny restrictions. Like I think there's one that is called the dichotomy cube, and it's designed. The only colors in the cube are black and white. And
that's cool.
It is, yeah. And then the person has tried to put all of these cards that are sort of mirror images of each other in the cube in various ways. So, for example, there's White Knight and Black Knight, and there's Grizzlebrand and Avacyn.
Avacyn, yeah.
Yeah, right. The original 8-man, I guess she is Archangel Avacyn or whatever. So stuff, and like desert cubes, which is a whole class of cube where you have to there's no basic land station that you go to at the end. You have to draft all your lands. Yeah.
Oh wow.
So anyway, just a huge variety of stuff is going to be there, and I can't wait. It's going to be awesome.
Well, I know for a fact you're probably going to be posting a lot of stuff, either throughout the event and then afterwards, right? You're going to be posting a lot of things. So I'm super excited to see how it all turns out for sure.
Yeah, and we should be streaming and stuff. So yeah, people will be able to tune in if they can't make it, and yeah, definitely be posting stuff about it. And I've got a YouTube channel, the Cultic Cube, and you catch me on Twitter at CulticCube for sure, because I love to talk about cube.
Yeah, of course, and I know you have your Cube Cobra links on your channel also, so that's great. People can see what you're building and what you got built, so that's a great starting point to get some pointers if you're looking for something. Just net deck, or I should say net cube. Right. John's cubes from Cube Cobra.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. This has been so great, and it's been wonderful getting your perspective on this particular type of cube that's your passion and you're excited about, and I've learned a great deal, and it's great to talk in person. Thank you so much for having me, Kirby.
Yeah, likewise. No problem, man. Any time. I'm always up for talking for all things cube, especially when it's something as niche as our passions.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Take care. Hope everything turns out well. All in all, there is no right way or wrong way to make a cube. However, since making a cube with which you're going to build a bona fide commander deck afterwards, that brings about certain challenges that will have to be tackled. Granted, however you choose to tackle them is up to you, since cubes are a very personal thing. In my experience, the simpler the process, the better, but hopefully you found some ideas and some solutions for yourself and your own cube. I want to take this opportunity to thank John for his appearance on this episode. If you haven't already, you should check out the Cultic Cube channel, which you can find a link for at the end of this video and in the description. John also has an amazing set of tokens in a collection called the Cultic Bestiary. These tokens are amazing, and I invite you to check them out. They will definitely give your decks that flair you're looking for. I admit I am pretty biased to these tokens myself, since the medieval flavor is something right up this humble barkeep's alley. I'll put a link to his tokens in the description as well. Definitely check them out. If you haven't already and want to take a gander at the current version of my Commander Cube, you can find links to it in the description, where you can see both the online version of my cube as well as the one I curate in real life. I have way more topics to cover in greater detail and depth for this mini-series, so stay tuned. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I also want to thank everyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. I want to once more thank John for joining me. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of Commander Cube Draft on the Commander Tavern. I am the Meta Kirby, and happy drafting.